Well, good afternoon, everyone. So glad to see you still here. You've survived this far into the conference. So thank you so much to SEMO and to everyone for having me out here. It's just a really great honor and privilege to be here with you. And so what I'd like to do today then is talk about this question of empirical research into prayer. And I'm going to ask a few questions here. First of all, why would we want to test prayer through empirical research? Secondly, how should prayer be tested empirically? Third, what does empirical research reveal? And then finally, why should seminaries care? And I hope that this really will be kind of practical and something that you can do something with as you come away from today's conference and this weekend. Oh, and we don't have it, so it advances one by one on here. Okay, that's unfortunate. It's supposed to click one at a time, but I guess it doesn't work on your screen. So you're going to get more on the screen at once than I would have ideally had, but you'll just have to work with me then on that. So the question of, well, why test prayer through empirical research? If you ask people whether they've witnessed a divine healing, you'll find that of Pentecostals, a very high percentage will say that they have. And so for Brazilian Pentecostals, that would be 77%, Kenyan Pentecostals, 87%, Indian Pentecostals, 74%, and even US Pentecostals, a bit lower, but still 62%. Now, it is true that you'll get higher numbers if you're talking about Pentecostals as opposed to other Christians or other people who are not Christians, but consider the fact that Pentecostals and closely connected charismatics account for a pretty high percentage of the world's Christians, so an estimated 635 million of them out of 2.4 billion Christians. And moreover, if you look kind of empirically at what accounts for the wildfire growth of Christianity around the world, very often the answer is a first-hand personal experience with prayer for healing or deliverance from evil spirits. And so I had the privilege of collaborating with 17 other scholars in a collection called Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Healing. And the common refrain that kept coming up in one study after another was this instance that it was these healing experiences that catalyzed conversion to Christianity. And so, for example, in China, the scholars who researched prayer there and the growth of Christianity there, they found that an estimated like 80% of converts, it was because they themselves or a family member had an experience with healing prayer. And so it's actually quite widespread. And then, moreover, if you look at retention rates for those who have had conversion experiences, in the U.S., say you have like what had been the era of Billy Graham evangelistic crusades, only about 6% actually stuck. Like even 6 months later, they were still associated with a Christian church. By contrast, if you look at the revivals of, say, Argentina, the rates there are more like 90% 5 years later. And if you ask the leaders of those revivals, well, what accounts for the longer retention? Their answer is actually because deliverance is a part of the conversion experience and entrance into church. That's a normal part of church life. We've got this widespread practice then of prayer for healing, and even the widespread perception that prayer for healing is effective. But there's still an empirical question of, are these perceptions accurate? And what would a medical kind of lens tell us about the effects of prayer? And so thus, it is an empirical question whether prayer actually has an effect on health. Does prayer improve or does it even worsen health? And should theologians, pastors, seminary professors, healthcare providers, policymakers, should they encourage or discourage prayer for miraculous healing, or how much emphasis should this be given? So that's kind of the rationale initially for why we would kind of consider empirical kinds of tests. A second factor, though, is that there is a certain kind of ambivalence about miraculous healing, for example, in the UK and in the US. So according to one study by the BBC, 62% of British Christians say that they pray for miracles. And 59% or rather 62% say that they believe miracles are possible. But that doesn't tell you like how much you expect them to happen or whether you pray for them. If you look at just Christians in the UK, that same survey will tell us that 59% of British Christians pray for healing. Only about 29% actually say that their prayers are answered. Now, if you kind of cross over the pond to the States, you'll find that even among medical doctors, to me this is a pretty surprisingly high number, that 73% of doctors say that they believe miracles occur today. And usually the reason, if you kind of probe into that question, is that there are doctors who just can't explain the recoveries of patients of theirs. People just recover, they ask the story, oh, well, I got prayer. And so the belief is actually quite high among very scientifically minded, very educated healthcare professionals. But there's still then the question of like, how do you kind of dive down into levels of belief, and how does kind of medical kind of science relate to beliefs? And so for the US data, there are actually several categories that you can look at. One would be those who are just, they're kind of hardcore skeptics. No amount of evidence you could present could possibly be enough to kind of convince you of a miracle. I mean, this is kind of your Humean and your kind of neo-Humean thinking. Miracles don't happen, and so empirical research really doesn't make any sense because miracles are incompatible with science, or healing just isn't for today, even if it was in biblical times. Then you've got another class, particularly of Christians, and often Pentecostal and charismatic Christians, who would say, well, yeah, we believe that miracles happen. They even happen today. Of course God heals, but we don't need proof for this. And in fact, we don't want to test God. And there's this kind of worry that if you get medical evaluation of prayers, that somehow that's going to like cause you to lose your healing, or that it'll kind of get in the way of kind of faith coming through hearing, not through seeing. And so if you see the evidence, that's going to somehow get in the way of faith. But there's another category, and this is where the empirical research kind of, I think, really makes the most difference. And that would be the third or so of people, at least in the States, who kind of mostly believe in miracles. They might say that we'd like to believe, but is there scientific evidence that would make this credible? And so if you're thinking of kind of target audiences for an empirical kind of lens, I mean, this really is that group that we would be aiming towards. So another kind of rationale for kind of why you might do empirical testing is, in the absence of this testing, there can actually be opposition to prayer for healing and claims of healing through prayer. And I'll give you an example of this in Bath with Healing on the Streets, or HOTS, which was forbidden from making claims about healing through prayer in 2012. And the reasoning of the Advertising Standards Authority is that testimonials are insufficient as evidence for claims of healing. You've got to have medical research if you want to be allowed to do this and claim that your prayers are going to be effective. So here's another kind of rationale for why we might want to do this testing, and it's the fact that there are other groups who have religiously premised healing practices who are publishing peer-reviewed scientific research studies. And this is true, for example, for Buddhist-inspired Reiki and mindfulness meditation. And there are kind of publications, and they've been enough to get these practices and others like them mainstreamed. And here I'll just say that if you want more on kind kind of what these religious foundations are, or kind of the prevalence. I mean, I've talked about this in a couple of the studies that I've done, the Healing Gods and Debating Yoga and Mindfulness, and I'm not really going to go into that anymore today. The point that I want to make, though, is that the evidence is actually pretty weak. That Reiki and mindfulness and other practices like acupuncture, chiropractic, or aromatherapy or homeopathy are effective, but just the very fact of having publications has been enough to get medical mainstreaming of these practices. And that's true for the UK, for even kind of National Health Service kinds of facilities. That's true in the US, where some 42% of hospitals, including major academic research centers, offer practices that include very much religiously premised things like Reiki and mindfulness. And just to kind of give you a sense of like what this level of evidence is, if you take a look at Reiki, there's a group called the Center for Reiki Research, including Reiki in hospitals. And basically it's an advocacy group, like you should put Reiki in hospitals. And so here's what they say on their website. The strongest evidence that Reiki has a demonstrable biological effect comes from the carefully controlled studies on rats by Baldwin and colleagues from 2006 and 2008. Well, if you actually look at these two studies, it is a grand total of 7 rats. 7 that improved with Reiki treatments. Another study was done quite recently, actually, and it had Reiki masters kind of detect, is there a human energy field kind of from a hand that's beneath a barrier versus like a prosthetic hand. And the effectiveness of these kind of Reiki masters, best qualified people to do Reiki, this is how they do their therapy, you've got to detect the field and then you manipulate it. They had a chance kind of level of likelihood of being able to kind of identify an energy field. They couldn't identify it. And years earlier, there was actually a similar study that was done of therapeutic touch, which is very popular in nursing professions, found the same exact result. And that study was actually designed by a 9-year-old for her science fair project. So meditation studies as well. There was a systematic review of 19,000 studies of meditation. There have been a lot of these studies. Only 47 of them were actually randomized controlled trials, and the conclusion of the review authors was that there's no evidence that meditation is any better than any other active treatment for the conditions for it was used. A lot of the studies of meditation rely heavily upon self-reports of those who say they feel less stressed after doing meditation. For some of these studies, researchers have also looked at, say, the cortisol levels, like, and kind of biological markers of stress. And they've actually found that people say they feel less stressed, they're actually more stressed after doing meditation. So you really can't rely so much on that self-report data. Another recent kind of very high quality study in Science Advances found that there's no evidence of neuroplastic changes from meditation, despite all of the claims that this changes your brain, it kind of makes you kind of have your gray matter kind of improve. There's not actually support for those widespread claims. And there is actually evidence of side effects or challenging results of meditation that include increased anxiety, anger, more depression, despair, acute psychotic episodes, and even suicidal ideation and attempts. And so these are not super safe, super effective methods, but there's research that's published in journals, and therefore that's in hospitals, and for the most part prayer is not, because no one's doing, or very few people are doing those kinds of studies for prayer. So if you're convinced by this point that there's some rationale for doing this kind of empirical research, the question is, well, how should you go about it? And here, these are kind of some of my Hubble Space Telescope pictures, just to make the point that, like, you can have different kinds of cameras, and you're going to get different kinds of kind of pictures and kind of fill out a complementary sense of kind of what's going on. And so a couple of different questions that we might ask. First of all, do medical records support claims of healing through prayer? And for this, we might look at comparisons of medical records from before and after prayer, or we might even look at case reports that compare medical and patient perspectives. And I'll talk about this in just a moment here. But then the second kind of question is, can these health outcomes of prayer actually be measured in some way? And for that, we need to look at clinical trials. So let's take a look at those in turn then. So what does empirical research reveal? I mean, there are thousands upon thousands of testimonies. For some of them, there have been medical records that have been presented to try and kind of support testimonial claims, and that includes quite a lot of different kinds of conditions. And here, for example, Catherine Coleman was influential in the 70s and published several volumes of testimonials that had medical records. For the most part, though, this is not kind of done. This is not a normal part of church healing ministries. But I kind of decided to do some kind of tracking down of records myself, and so this is kind of from Testing Prayer. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of the people who I tracked down, and I mean, this is like needle in a haystack kind of work. It's very hard to find these kinds of records, but I'll give you an example of someone we'll just call Daisy for our purposes. And she was diagnosed with a progressively worsening hereditary inner ear problem, and she wore hearing aids for 30 years. In 1999, tests showed that she had moderate hearing loss, and then in 2004, and that's the picture that you have up there on the left, her hearing loss was now at this point moderately severe to severe, and the right ear is designated by the O, the left ear is the X. At the bottom of the chart, you can see the speech recognition levels, which are a 60 in both ears. Well, in 2008, Daisy received prayer, and she, quote, felt my fingers on fire and the warmth of the Holy Spirit inside of me, after which she could reportedly hear without her hearing aids. Well, she went back to the same audiologist, the same kind of audiology equipment was used to retest her. This was 2 weeks after her healing experience, and this is in 2008, and that's the illustrations that you have on your right, or rather that's a copy of the medical reports. And what you can see here is that she's got normal hearing frequency or thresholds in the lower frequencies, although she still has somewhat moderate loss in the higher frequencies. But the key point is that the data points move up on the chart, indicating quite significantly better hearing. And I consulted with kind of specialists who said, we don't see this kind of change. Like, this is just not something that you ever are going to observe in terms of kind of what happens with someone with this condition. Moreover, we can see the speech recognition levels are now 25 in the right, 15 in the left, which is an improvement. You want to go down on the speech recognition levels. And then she had another screening for employment purposes in 2010, which showed that the results, she was still kind of showing these better results in her hearing. Now, the medical records, importantly, do not prove that God healed Daisy through prayer. What they do show, however, is that Daisy's claim of improved hearing is validated by the medical records. And I think that's an important distinction to make. We don't want to over-claim what records can show us. Let me give you one more example here. Well, I'll give you a couple examples, but this one's similar in the sense that Joy is a kind of another pseudonym for another person who I interviewed and kind of collected records from. She was diagnosed with an eye disorder called vertical heterophoria, and I mean, the lay description is kind of like her head or her eyes are like sort of out of shape, and it meant that she would get migraine headaches and she needed prism lenses to be able to see. And what we have are medical records that show kind of she's got the diagnosis, she's got the prescription, and then she has another medical record showing that she doesn't need corrective lenses anymore. So the records do not provide an explanation of why Joy's vision improved, but they do confirm the notation of improvement by medical professionals. So Joy then fills in her own explanation of what happened, and she says that she'd received prayer at a number of services, right? She'd gotten prayer over and over again. She was persistent in getting prayer. And during one of those services, the group was singing, they were in worship, and they were singing songs about entering into God's marvelous light. And she heard a voice that she identified as from God telling her, well, you get to live in that light. And that was significant because like light hurt her eyes. And so she kind of felt her head kind of being pulled back into shape, and then she was able to read fine print in a Bible. She discontinued her anti-migraine headaches, and I was able to check up with Joy as well as Daisy several years later, and she was still doing fine. So again, we have medical kind of confirmation of some of the claims that were being made by the person testifying to healing through prayer. I'll give you another example here, and you may have come across Heidi Baker, a well-known charismatic missionary in Mozambique. Not only is she kind of active in praying for healing for others, but she herself claims to have had a number of dramatic healing experiences. So for instance, of dyslexia, pneumonia, multiple sclerosis, in which she was like paralyzed on half of her body and blind in one eye. I don't have any records from that, but what I do have are records from when she contracted methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA infection, and this had been like, she'd had it a bunch of times, and every time you get it, it gets worse, essentially. Well, she was hospitalized, and she had been in Malaysia and then in South Africa in a hospital for 32 days on the strongest antibiotics available for MRSA, and the doctors told her, well, as long as you're on the drip, we can probably keep you alive at least for a while, but this is not something curable, and you should write your tombstone because you're going to die. Well, she didn't like that diagnosis, so she had her husband check her out of the hospital to go see a, quote, specialist in Toronto, by which she meant Jesus. She was supposed to preach in Toronto, so they struggle to get her on the plane. They get her over to Toronto. She kind of does this long flight, and immediately she's supposed to go up to preach. Well, no one thought that she was going to preach because, well, she was dying, so she struggles her way up on the screen, and I've got the conference DVD of her preaching. And she preached a 2-hour-long sermon in which she actually looks stronger at the end of the sermon than at the beginning. And her explanation later is that she felt like these 3 waves of power go through her body as she experienced like just healing of all of the scars. And then she says that she went out running in the running shoes that her husband Roland had bought her as kind of a sign of faith, and went running for an hour with no effects. Well, her mother said, you still need to go see a real specialist, so let's go to California. And so I got the emergency room records from that California hospital where they kind of, again, her report is they wanted to kind of roll her in for emergency surgery. As soon as she got there, she said, well, please can you kind of examine me first before you do this, because I think I was healed. And so here's what the records show. They show that the medical professionals were convinced that she had had MRSA. But that she no longer required surgery or hospitalization, and she had lab tests done that showed no evidence of remaining Staphylococcus aureus bacteria. So in other words, this doesn't prove that Heidi Baker was healed through prayer, but it does show she wasn't just making this up, right? Like, we have medical records and a DVD that kind of confirm the kinds of claims that she was making. So let me give you one contrasting example, and we're going to call this individual Frank. I realized long after I decided on that name that there was a certain irony in the name, because he wasn't actually all that frank in what he had to say. He had told me that he'd had a shrapnel wound and he'd been unable to read with his left eye for 24 years, and so I said, well, hey, I'd love to see your medical records. Could you send those to me? And so he did, but then I also followed up with the optometrist's office that produced the records. And what they told me is, oh yes, this is our patient. This is indeed Frank. We know him well. And the records are from our office, but they've been altered. So what he told me was that on 02, the left eye without correction is 2200, but now in 2007, it's 2040. And so the note you can see from the office is that, well, those bits are not actually our writing, and so actually, like a couple months after the supposed healing, his vision was still 2200. It wasn't any better. I tried following up with him. He basically stopped returning my phone calls, at which point I had to just kind of let that go for ethical reasons. And I mean, he was a kind of like attention kind of getting kind of guy, so maybe he thought that this would make him look good, and even though I told him these were going to be de-identified records, I mean, notice you kind of like blot out all the identifying information. Maybe he was trying to help make a case for healing prayer. Well, it didn't, because this is the kind of example you're all going to go home and remember, even though in all the time that I've been doing this research, I've found 2 examples like this. I don't think this is the norm, but this is another reason for doing empirical tests, to be able to kind of sort out the wheat from the chaff in terms of claims that are being made. And so I think that's actually really important for credibility, is that you have checks of that sort. So there has been a little bit of research that's being done, and some of which in Europe. And so at the Amsterdam University Medical Center, there have been efforts to do some retrospective case-based studies of prayer. And basically what that means is collecting medical records from people who kind of have claimed to have healing experiences and kind of compare. Well, what do you get? The results have not honestly been all that impressive from this particular group. And so, for instance, one of the reports that they published, there were 3 cases of individuals who claimed that they could hear a lot better after they got prayer, but there was a mismatch between their subjective interpretations and the objective findings. In other words, the medical records showed that they actually had the same hearing levels before and after prayer, but they still perceived God as like healing them and helping them. So it still seemed beneficial to them, but it was a kind of mismatch. Another report that this group published, this time they found that out of 27 kind of cases, there were 11 of them that were kind of medically remarkable recoveries. So there was a kind of confirmation from the records, although still the majority of them, there was that kind of mismatch. But across all of these cases, there were some common features. So there was a kind of, it was when people were prayed for that they experienced an improvement, and it was instant, and it was actually unexpected, and this kind of challenges some of the assumptions that people can make about faith and healing. Often healing is actually unexpected. It's not that people are saying, oh, I had so much faith and therefore I got healed, and actually this is supported by some larger scale survey research that I did for testing prayer, where it didn't actually make any difference whether people said that they had faith or they didn't have faith, whether they experienced healing or not. So I think that can actually be overestimated as a factor. But they also kind of, another pattern was there were these strong emotional and physical manifestations, a sense of being overwhelmed and transformed by God. And the positive effects persisted for years. Between 5 and 33 years, only 2 cases of relapse were kind of experienced out of this cohort. And so the conclusion of the authors is that the biomedical conceptual framework just isn't really adequate to account for these kinds of experiences of improvement. So I want to look then at some other results from another group that's been one of the more active in trying to do this kind of research, the Global Medical Research Institute, which was actually inspired by kind of the work done in testing prayer. Most of the researchers who are kind of research scientists and medical doctors are either in the US or are in Brazil, but the group is certainly interested in being genuinely global in what's being done, and there have been some case reports that are published, and last I looked they were still down there on the book table, but you can also just download them for free from the Global MRI or GMRI website, and so I'll talk about these reports. The first of them is a case report of healing from gastroparesis, which is an inability to digest food, and so the presenting condition was a 2-week-old infant was vomiting forcefully and just couldn't tolerate food. So a tube was inserted for feeding, and for 16 years, this individual was exclusively tube fed. So, and this family, they attended a non-denominational cessationist church that believed that, well, miracles, those happened in Bible times, they ceased, they don't happen today, but they somehow found themselves at a Pentecostal church service, and the visiting healing evangelist happened to have a very interesting story in that he himself had had healing from an intestinal condition. In fact, the condition had been that he was doing repairs underneath a truck, and it was indeed a 22,000 kilogram truck that fell on him and severed his intestines entirely. So he somehow survived this, and he was like being drip fed, and it wasn't enough to get nutrition so he was actually dying gradually from lack of nutrition. Well, he had a dramatic healing experience, so then he prays for this now 16-year-old boy for healing. Well, as the boy is receiving prayer, he feels this like pulsating electrical sensation go from his shoulder down diagonally through his stomach. And then he decided to go out to eat that night and ate a meal with no ill effects for the very first time in his life. Well, he kept doing that for a period of 4 months. They removed the tube, and now this has been like 7 years since that took place. The patient's perspective is, I've thoroughly enjoyed the new adventure of trying all different types of food. And he was planning to become a doctor himself to try and help others who had had such experiences. So the other case, and that's published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, the other case that I'll highlight here is of instantaneous resolution of juvenile macular degeneration blindness. And so here the story was, it was an 18-year-old female who lost most of her central vision over the period of 3 months in the year 1959. Her visual acuity was evaluated as less than 2400, which would be the standard for legal blindness. And she was blind for 12 years. Before one night, she and her husband were praying for her healing, and they'd never seen anyone healed through prayer. They weren't quite cessationists, but they had no experiential basis. But they started crying out to God and praying, God, you can do this tonight. So they pray. She opens her eyes, and she can see her husband for the first time. And she sees pictures of her children for the first time and actually can identify them. And her uncorrected visual acuity after this was measured at 2100 in each eye, which is good enough to be able to see. And with correction, it was actually 2030 and 2040 in her 2 eyes. And her eyesight has now remained intact for over 47 years. So here's what she says about her experience. I was blind. I attended a school for the blind. I read Braille. I walked with a white cane. And in a moment, after years of darkness, I could see perfectly. Right, so that's her experience. And again, that's published in a medical journal. So the original kind of plan for how GMRI was supposed to be set up is they kind of had a website and they had a portal. If you've been healed miraculously, send in your medical records and we'll kind of evaluate them and publish them. Well, guess how many medical records got sent in? Almost none is basically the answer. And they realized there's all kinds of barriers to kind of people actually kind of sending the records in for something like this. And so they realized this needed to be a much more kind of research-centered, kind of researcher-centered kind of process. And so there is a team of researchers, and then they track down leads to testimonies and get research ideas. Well, this one looks promising. I mean, this is a case of cancer, and it's impressive that this person improved, but, well, they probably got other medical treatment, and they should. But how do you kind of separate out what's medical, what's not medical? The problem with cancer is there's like relapses and remissions. Same thing with a lot of back pain, is it's just kind of diffuse. It's hard to kind of evaluate. Multiple sclerosis, that often kind of is like an on-again, off-again thing. So they found that there are kind of particular kinds of cases. And so like the two kind of that I just gave, or genetic conditions, those can be kind of fruitful. And so the process then is to then investigate these cases. And most of them honestly just end up not meeting the kinds of standards that are necessary to communicate to really skeptical audiences. It doesn't mean the person wasn't healed through prayer. It doesn't mean it's not a wonderful story. It just doesn't quite fit this model. And kind of for point of reference, if you're familiar with the medical board for the Shrine of Lords, they've kind of validated something like 67, the last I saw, total kind of miracles out of like thousands upon thousands that have been evaluated over decades of time. But occasionally you do this work, you put the time in, you consult with the medical specialists, and it results in a publication. And so it does happen, but it takes a lot of work to be able to do this. So the other dimension then, so I talked about kind of the case reports and the comparison of patient and medical perspectives. The other kind of research that's really important is the clinical trial. And here, the gold standard has been the double-blinded kind of randomized control study. And so the effort that's been kind of made mostly by researchers is what are called distant intercessory prayer studies. You'll have a couple of different groups of patients, and intercessors, like usually like born-again Christians, will be given like the first name and the condition of the people, and then they pray for them. And some of these studies have reported positive effects. The best known of these are one by Bird and colleagues on coronary patients, and then another one kind of motivated by that by Harris and colleagues. But then what got more kind of popular attention was actually a study by Harvard's Herbert Benson in 2006, in which he found that he had three groups. He had the group that wasn't getting prayer, the group that got prayer but they didn't know it, and then the group that got prayer and they did know it. And there were no benefits to getting prayer, but if you knew you were getting prayer, you actually fared worse. And the hypothesis was that people were worried that they were in such bad shape that they needed prayer. And you're a coronary patient, you're anxious, that's not good for your health and your heart, so they did worse. So they're not actually saying necessarily prayer is bad for your health, but so here's the thing that never got publicized with the Benson study. The only group of Protestant intercessors that he had belonged to the Unity School of Christianity, which is a New Thought group, the leaders of which teach that miraculous healing should not be expected. Petitionary prayer is, quote, useless because the divine is not really a thing. It's just you think positively and you kind of speak positively. So the problem here is with what can be referred to as construct validity. What you're calling prayer here in the Benson study is very different from a kind of expectant faith prayer of what like people in this group or Pentecostals would be doing. So my conclusion is you don't want the Unity people to be praying for you. I'm not sure it tells you anything about whether kind of Pentecostal or evangelical prayer would be effective. But there's another issue that comes up in all of these studies of distant intercessory prayer, and it's what we might call ecological validity. And it's a matter of like, are you studying what people actually do in real life? And so these laboratory conditions, like sure, people have names on prayer lists and email chains, but when there's expectant prayer, it's usually people getting up close, there's touch, there's emotion, it's really hard to control clinically, but that's how prayer happens. And so for that reason, I coined the term proximal intercessory prayer. And before that term came into kind of being, there was a study that actually made a comparison between the distant and the up-close prayer. And that was done by Matthews and colleagues. And importantly, one of the collaborators on this study was the charismatic Catholic Francis McNutt. He and his team were the ones doing the praying, and then it was being studied. And what they found was that proximal prayer had an effect, distant prayer did not. Now, unfortunately, rheumatoid arthritis is one of those conditions where there is a kind of mind-body connection, and so it may not be the best condition to evaluate for this sort of study, but there wasn't really a lot else out there. And so I kind of brought together some researchers to do a study. I named it the Study of the Therapeutic Effects of Proximal Intercessory Prayer, or STEP. So I've got STEP with 2 P's in reference to Benson's study of STEP with 1 P. It is a response to Benson's study. And we decided to follow around Heidi Baker in Mozambique because that's where, like, a lot of the reports of where are people being healed of kind of severe hearing and vision problems, and it was happening in Mozambique. And so we followed her around. We kind of hear she and her husband Roland are pictured, and I mean they have started now something like 10,000 plus churches in dozens of countries, and take care of orphan children and those who are still blind. They take care of them until until they're healed. Here's a picture of a typical mud hut village. I took that picture while we were visiting. They do have medical clinics, but all they really have, at least when I was there, was like deworming pills and antibiotics. They just don't have a lot of resources, so they depend a lot on prayer. But we took a portable audiometer and vision charts, and we evaluated every single person who was brought up being kind of identified by their community as having vision or hearing problems. And typically, Heidi Baker's approach is she preaches, shows the Jesus film, and then she'll say, kind of, I'm making a promise that God's going to heal your blind and your deaf in response to prayer, and that's proof that he's the real God. And your kind of other healers, they're robbing you, they're charging you money, this is free. So then the community who's known these people their whole lives, bring them up, she prays for them, and then they report healing. And we tested every single person who was brought forward, whether or not any kind of claim was made that they were healed, whether or not they received prayer. And so kind of a misconception is often if you have a small sample size, that means you can't have statistical significance. That's not true. What it does mean, though, is you've got to have a consistent enough effect that's large enough. And we did get that kind of consistency and scale of effects that we found statistically significant results, and it was published in a medical journal. So for hearing, we found highly significant improvements post-PIP, or proximal intercessory prayer. 3 subjects went from being unable to read the top line of a vision chart, which is 2400, to being able to read 2080 or better, which is like basically pretty small print. We had 1 individual who went from, okay, I'm sorry, I was on hearing. Okay, so this was the hearing improvements. I got my slides out of order there. So we got the highly significant improvements. 2 subjects had their thresholds reduced by 50 decibels. Scale on that. If you're standing by a motorcycle, that's like 100 decibels. If it's a quiet room, you've got 0 perfect hearing. That's like 0. So in other words, that's a really big scale of hearing improvement. And then similarly with vision, we found significant improvements, kind of fine lines of a vision chart, or someone who went from being unable to count fingers from a foot away, being able to read print on an eye chart. And it's not that the conditions somehow were better when we did the retesting than before. We measured that to control that as much as was possible in the climate that we are in. There have been studies of hypnosis and suggestion for vision and hearing, and usually what you get is about like 1 line of improvement on a vision chart, so you get some improvement, but if you compare hypnosis and suggestion, much more improvement from PIP that you can identify, and that's relevant because the same sorts of mind-body interactions are at play with hypnosis as what you might expect with prayer. Moreover, we did a replication study in Brazil, and we found basically the same results, and those are all reported in testing prayer. So GMRI is also planning to do some clinical trials, and so one is, this got postponed by COVID, but now is back underway to study the effects of prayer on pain and anxiety in a primary care setting. This is done in collaboration with the University of Maryland Medical Centers in Baltimore, and it will be a randomized controlled trial. Patients presenting with chronic pain and or anxiety will be randomized to a Prayer Now or Prayer Next Visit group. All groups will receive standard medical care, and the question is, well, do patients who receive prayer at first visit do better at follow-up than those who do not? So why should seminaries care? And here I am starting to wind down. So there is a need for kind of seminaries to be providing education to kind of this generation and next generation of religious leaders. Church leaders tend to mistrust researchers, and there have been exposés, Nightline, I mean, even Christian researchers, this just worry, and there's kind of a lack of information about protection of personal health information. It's like, oh, well, we're gonna well, no, you de-identify the records, you protect people's information. So there's just not really an understanding of the value of this kind of research. And so the first kind of level is to communicate with religious leaders that this is actually valuable, even evangelistically, and valuable for the church. Secondly, church members, even those who have really incredible healing testimonies with medical records, they're afraid. And this is kind of my long experience, having worked on this now for a good number of years. People are afraid about kind of this testing God thing, that they're going to lose their healing, or they're somehow not going to have faith if they participate in this kind of research. The other thing that a kind of center like this can be important for is just simply communicating the value of this kind of research, and frankly, kind of communicating the value of financial giving. It takes a lot of hours to do this kind of research. It doesn't take actually all that much money, but no one's giving money for this kind of research anywhere, and so it just isn't being done, or it's being done at just a snail's pace because of a lack of resources. But there's also an opportunity here. There is actually quite a lot of theological and popular interest in this kind of research. This is indicated, for instance, by Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Miracles. Strobel is, if you don't know, is a New York Times bestselling author. He was an atheist journalism who wrote about his radical conversion in The Case for Christ, which was then made into a movie. Well, this is one of his many Case for books, The Case for Miracles, in which he interviewed skeptics and then interviewed theologians and researchers, and he sold copies of this book. There's interest in this. Likewise, the theologian Craig Keener, who also was an atheist turned prolific theologian, who is kind of drawing upon, and I mean, he's not a researcher, so he needs the researchers to provide him with the material to then write and popularize this kind of theologically. And then finally, Elijah Stevens is a filmmaker who interviewed skeptics and theologians and healing practitioners and researchers, for instance, from GMRI. And if you're interested in those case reports, some of the examples in Send Proof are actually interviews with the people who are in the case reports with anonymous reports, because that's how GMRI does things, but they volunteered to kind of disclose their identities for the sake of the movie. And so you can hear their stories. And really the question here is, if miracles are real, where's the evidence? And that's a question that is actually being asked by quite a lot of people who are thinking people who are open to belief, and that is the opportunity. And so those of you who are involved in medical fields, right, there are opportunities to become involved. If you're in more theological fields, you've got opportunities to communicate with researchers, and all of you have opportunities to kind of understand the value, again, I think evangelistically, in communicating not just a kind of theoretical or theological compatibility between miracles and science, but to actually kind of then demonstrate practically hands-on those connections. And so there are some resources available. I mean, Amazon has any of the books as well as the film available, and you can download for free articles and find out more about the Global Medical Research Institute. So I will leave you with that, and thank you for your kind attention. Yeah, so the first question, basically you answered it yourself. It's really hard with mental health conditions because it's the same problems of both relapses and other conditions. So I think that's an important area of research. There certainly have been a couple of very interesting books by psychiatrists. One, Scott Peck's work, and he's done a couple of books on this, and then more recently Richard Gallagher, and you can, if you look up their names, you'll find the titles. So they're psychiatrists who argue for the need for actually exorcisms and deliverance, as sometimes like psychiatric treatment isn't enough, but this kind of research, I think we'd have to figure out a way to do that. Your second question, I think previous to this talk, I would not have answered that question. I would have dodged it, but I'm going to change of seasons, and I'm going to give you a very brief answer to that question. The research actually came from the personal experience rather than the other way around. And the super short version of this is that in 2003, my brain scientist, kind of PhD in neuroscience husband had a seizure and was diagnosed with what would have been a terminal brain tumor, and he could read the fMRI reports and knew just how bad it was. And he was totally miraculously healed, and deliverance from evil spirits was a part of that healing. I don't think he would have been healed if he hadn't have had deliverance, and that's, after the talk I can fill in details where needed. That completely changed our lives. And so I started kind of moving away from writing kind of nice books about kind of reading and writing practices, hymns and memoirs, and I mean, that's all fine and that's all good, but it wasn't like living and real for me. So everything I've done since 2003 has been gratitude. And And my husband, Josh, I mean, he's the one who's the chair of Global Medical Research Institute. This is our lives. And we've been praying for people for healing and deliverance for almost 20 years now. That doesn't mean everything's perfect. It doesn't mean we don't ever get sick. It doesn't mean that there aren't challenges as we raise teenagers. But it does mean that our lives are much different, and I would say better as a result. Yeah, I mean, those are great and difficult questions. I mean, I think we're kind of just figuring out what it means for groups like this to advocate for this kind of partnership. I think it means partly welcoming your medical personnel, and I've had some lovely chats today along those lines, and kind of communicating your value for medical professionals. So I think that partly it's a larger issue of a mistrust between Christians and church leaders, and I mean, COVID accentuated this, honestly, right? Like, there's a mistrust of scientists, and so partly it's a matter of valuing what scientists and medical professionals do, and including examples, like not only asking people for testimonies, but asking people for kind of medical records, like keeping your eyes open for incredible kind of testimonies like this. I think that those are a couple of steps in this direction. And then the issue of kind of correlation and causality, I mean, I think if you want the claims of healing through prayer to be credible, you don't want to overstate the case. And I mean, there have been the high-profile examples of just out-and-out fraud, right? Like having something in your ear and kind of having the words of knowledge fed to you. And I mean, that does sadly happen sometimes. Again, I think that's much rarer than people think. And so if you're just very clear in kind of saying this is a wonderful testimony and kind of let it be that, and I think this gets back to some of the things we've talked about during the conference. Like, God can work through medicine. God can work through natural means, quickening the body's healing practice, kind of, but just to kind of say, like, I think, like, well, there's these three kinds of miracles, like we heard earlier today, right? I mean, I think there's kind of more than one kind of healing testimony, and to say, like, and this one kind of like is like, they're all great, but this one has this kind of very strong medical support behind it. And so just that kind of nuance, I think, can be helpful. Yeah, no, I love the question. I mean, so here's the patterns that I see, and they again, I think, are going to kind of contradict some of the assumptions. It's the persevering prayer. Like, so one of the survey answers that I got when I was in Brazil was, I just went to a prayer marathon, and I got prayer like 47 times for this like vision condition, and it was like on the 47th that she got. So that's very different from the kind of word of faith model. You pray once, you claim it by faith, you don't need the kind of like reduction in symptoms to kind of make your claim. It's like, it's okay to kind of wait for you actually to feel better. In fact, I mean, if you go back to the gospel, so I mean, I think that perseverance is one of the common patterns. And the significance of something that may seem like a minor healing, like back pain, that can be really significant. And that's also from the survey data, that like someone who's like, I got healed 35 years ago from back pain, and that's like made this huge difference in my life. So that may not be a GMRI case report, but that's still super significant for that individual. And these healings happen in Europe. They happen in the States. They do not just happen in other parts of the world. That is just important, that all kinds of conditions are being healed, and they're happening all over the world, regardless of whether you kind of think of yourself as filled with faith or not. And so the other pattern I want to mention is that people who experience healing through prayer, they often go out and they pray for other people. And then they experience healing through prayer, and they go out and they pray for other people. And that's what I call a kind of ripple effect of healing prayer. And that's what caused the growth of Christianity in the first century. That's what's causing the growth of Christianity around the world. Like, sure, this may be a little bit slow here, slow in the States, but most of the world, it's growing, and it's through kind of all different kinds of conditions being healed because of God's compassion, not just because of God's concern about proof. Here's my thought. What am I doing? I'm wearing glasses, because my vision is not perfect, right? My first line of response is I go to the eye doctor. Now, if I'm in Mozambique, I'm not going to have an eye doctor, at least in the rural areas where Heidi Baker's based. And so your first line of response is to seek after prayer. Now, when we run out of kind of what medical science can do, right? My husband gets a brain tumor. You know, we're all of a sudden really interested in, does Jesus heal people through prayer? Or when someone kind of has a tumor growing on their stomach and they're afraid to tell anyone about it in the States, and I'm thinking of an actual example here, and it dissolves in 10 minutes. So, I mean, you do see all the same kinds of miracles, but there is kind of a default tendency, I think, where medical science is widely available to make that the first line of recourse, and not even necessarily to think of praying for healing, or to give up really quickly if we do kind of say, well, I'll pray, but then I'm going to kind of find a way to explain why I shouldn't get my hopes up for pressing in for prayer, because I don't want to be disappointed and I don't want God to look bad, and so I'm not going to keep pressing in. And I think we tend to do a lot of kind of reasoning ourselves out of persevering faith. I define faith as perseverance, not as kind of a state of like somehow I'm going to say I believe, right? It's if you're willing to kind of persevere in prayer, I'd call that faith. Yes, so I think you're definitely going to get that skeptical response. My question is, how often is kind of someone hugging you and loving you going to just make you go from being able to read the top line of a vision chart to being able to read fine print, right? My assessment of the data is there's more than you can explain. So sure, there's some element of kind of you're experiencing love. I don't think it's enough based upon the data. I think that there is a kind of vulnerability in asking people to pray for you. And that's kind of partly my kind of theological explanation as to why it makes a difference to have other people praying. Also, I mean, we've been hearing in talks about how God likes to work through people. There are different gifts of healings and of miracles. And it seems like kind of, again, from the empirical data, that some people are more gifted in praying for one kind of condition than another. So Francis McNutt, he had a lot of success with rheumatoid arthritis. That's why they did that study. Heidi Baker seems to have a lot of success with vision and with hearing. So there do seem to be some differences in the kinds of gifts of healing, and yet you'll find testimonies of people, kind of just ordinary folks doing the praying. When we did the follow-up in Brazil, it was ordinary folks doing the praying, and we still were getting those kinds of outcomes. So do you mean kind of getting people's hopes up? Yeah. So let me give you the opposite side of that ethical question. So back to our own anecdote, since I put that on the table. When we kind of first started investigating kind of getting prayer, we were a part of a Calvinist cessationist church, and the senior pastor, very helpfully, he thought, came to tell us, don't get your hopes up because I don't want you to lose your faith when you die. And and then proceeded to give us a testimony of someone who'd been diagnosed with a brain tumor who lived longer than anyone expected, but who was currently dying. I would say that was not ethical, and that was harmful, and we forgave, we blessed, we moved on to a different church where people would press in. So I think the tendency can be to worry, well, what about the people who aren't going to get healed? I would say, but what about the people who are going to get healed, and that you're going to discourage them from pressing in? And especially given the pattern that it seems like the perseverance is a big factor in people getting healed, if you kind of encourage people to give up too soon. So I think you definitely don't want to be blaming people for lack of faith or lack of holiness. That's been done far too often in the healing ministry, very damagingly. But I don't it's a false dichotomy between those two. And I think part of the problem is we end up blaming God for things that Satan has done. And we want to explain it, and we want to not kind of get people's hopes up, and as a result, we end up basically saying that it's God who must want the person to be sick. Well, just because something is doesn't mean that that's what things should be, because there is a battle between kingdoms. I mean, hopefully it's kind of Pentecostals, you kind of have a sense that there's a battle, and it's an ongoing battle. And so I don't claim to understand why one person is healed and one person is not healed, right? It is a mystery. Anyone who is honest is going to say, I don't understand, I don't know. But I'm not going to, like when it was us, we didn't have a plan B. We are going to kind of get healed or die trying. And I think that's my ethical response. Yeah, I'm making a theological claim here. And so here I am kind of shamelessly borrowing from Randy Clark, who has been very influential for me. He was a vineyard pastor influenced by John Wimber. And he describes it as a difference between a blueprint and a warfare model. And the blueprint is whatever happens, by definition, must be God's will. Whereas warfare is that sense of competing kingdoms. And this is where the founding of the Vineyard movement was all about that already not yet theology. And in the early days of the Vineyard, it was about pressing in for more breakthroughs. And my assessment is that not only in Vineyard, but beyond that, there's been a tendency to kind of explain away kind of why we're not getting more breakthroughs, and to kind of sit with that not yet, and to be satisfied with that. And rather than pushing forward for kind of more of the breakthroughs. And I mean, it comes back to Job, right? It's like the answer was to the question was not that, it wasn't that God sent things, it was Satan who did it. And it kind of takes a whole lot of narrative and experience to get there. And yes, there's roles for permission, but it's battle. And that's how I think of prayer. I mean, Jesus said it was the enemy who came to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly.